Daniel Thompson, a devoted Ohio father, married for 15 years, seemed like the perfect husband and family man. But behind the walls of his quiet suburban home, he carried a secret life, one that would end in violence when he shot Marissa, a trans woman he had been secretly involved with. What started as a hidden affair spiraled into a shocking crime that left his family shattered and his community stunned. Daniel Thompson's life in the suburbs of Ohio looked like a storybook. For 15 years, he had been married to his wife Laura, building a family that seemed steady and dependable. Their 2 children were active in school activities, and their home sat neatly on a tree-lined street with trimmed lawns and friendly neighbors. To anyone looking from the outside, Daniel was a husband who provided, father who coached Little League, and a man who had earned respect among his peers. He attended church regularly, kept his promises to his family, and showed up to neighborhood events with a warm smile. It was the kind of life people admired, the kind of life many wished they had. Daniel worked as an account manager at a mid-sized company, a job that wasn't flashy but paid enough to keep his family comfortable. He was the type of man who others described as reliable and steady. His wife, Laura, often spoke with pride about how lucky she felt to have someone so dedicated. Their children adored him, and in photographs, his arm was always draped lovingly around them. His image was consistent everywhere, stable, trustworthy, and safe. But this polished exterior was carefully built, layer by layer, to hide a different truth brewing beneath the surface. Over time, the perfect picture began to weigh heavily on him. Daniel felt trapped inside a role he had chosen years ago, one that demanded constant upkeep. He played the part of the husband who never faltered, the father who was always present, the friend who could be counted on. But while others saw a man living the dream, he felt the dream pressing down on him, closing in tighter each year. Still, he kept smiling at barbecues, shaking hands with neighbors, and waving at passing cars. His mask never slipped in public. The Thompson family calendar was filled with ordinary suburban routines. Saturdays were spent at soccer fields, Sundays at church, and weeknights around the dinner table. Every corner of their lives painted the picture of stability, yet Daniel's mind often wandered during those dinners. Drifting away from the laughter of his children and the chatter of his wife, he found himself staring blankly at the walls of his home, imagining another version of himself, one not bound by the expectations of his community. It was during these moments that his double life quietly began to form. No one noticed the long hours he claimed to spend working late, or the trips he explained away as business. No one saw the weight he carried when he closed the bedroom door at night and stared into the darkness. What his family didn't know, what his neighbors never suspected, was that Daniel was living 2 versions of himself. One was the man everyone thought they knew, and the other was a secret he would guard with everything he had. The cracks were invisible to those around him, but for Daniel, they were widening every day. Behind the clean-cut image and carefully maintained reputation, there was a storm building. The life that seemed so perfect was balancing on a fragile edge, one that would eventually break apart in the most devastating way. Daniel's hidden life began quietly, without anyone noticing. It started as late-night browsing on his computer after Laura had gone to bed. The glow of the screen became his companion, and soon he stumbled into online spaces where people spoke freely, away from the pressures of suburban expectations. It was there that he first connected with Marissa, a trans woman who had recently moved to Ohio, seeking acceptance and a new beginning. Their conversations started small, harmless at first, messages about music, books, and the loneliness they both felt. But those messages grew into something deeper, something Daniel wasn't prepared for yet, couldn't resist. For Marissa, Daniel's attention felt genuine. He listened to her stories, validated her struggles, and made her feel seen. For Daniel, she represented escape from the suffocating box he had built around himself. She was someone who existed outside of his world of PTA meetings, office politics, and backyard cookouts. Their connection gave him the thrill of freedom, a chance to be someone different, if only in stolen moments. The more they spoke, the more he craved that secret world. Eventually, conversations turned into meetings. At first, Daniel made excuses, claiming late work hours or business dinners. He would drive across town, his heart racing as he parked outside small apartments or rented rooms where they could be alone. Each visit came with the rush of danger, the risk of being caught, but Daniel convinced himself he had control. He believed he could manage both lives if he was careful. He told himself no one would ever know. Marissa never asked for much at the beginning. She was simply happy to have someone who seemed to care for her. Yet, as months passed, she started to want more. She wanted honesty, openness, and acknowledgement of the relationship they were building. Daniel, however, panicked at the thought. He knew that if word of their connection ever reached his wife, his children, or his community, everything he had worked for would collapse. He carried that fear with him everywhere, hiding it under the same smile he wore to family gatherings. The secrecy tightened around him like a noose. He became more creative with his lies, more careful with his movements. Hidden bank withdrawals, paid for dinners and hotel rooms. Disposable phones carried conversations that he kept locked away. At home, he cleared his internet history obsessively, checking and double-checking that nothing suspicious would lead back to him. He convinced himself this was survival, that the only way to keep his world intact was to bury the other one deeper. But Daniel was playing a dangerous game. The more he invested in Marissa, the harder it became to pull away. Each meeting tied him closer to her, while at the same time threatening the stability of the life he had built with Laura. He lived with the constant fear of exposure, a fear that grew stronger every time Marissa asked for more honesty. What began as an escape from pressure was turning into a source of it, and Daniel could feel the weight of both lives pressing down on him at once. It was no longer just a hidden affair. It was a secret that had the power to destroy everything. And though he thought he could manage it forever, the cracks in his carefully constructed mask were already starting to show. Laura was the first to notice that something about her husband was different. For years, Daniel had been steady and predictable, but lately, his patterns shifted. He came home later than usual, carrying vague explanations that never quite satisfied her questions. Sometimes he seemed restless at night, staring at the ceiling instead of falling asleep beside her. Other times, he buried himself in his phone, quickly turning the screen away if she walked into the room. Small things, glances, silences, and excuses began to add up. Laura felt an unease she couldn't name, though she pushed it aside, telling herself that every marriage had its rough patches. In the neighborhood, whispers began to circulate. A neighbor claimed to have seen Daniel on the other side of town, alone, in a place where no one expected him to be. Another mentioned spotting him at odd hours in areas far from his office. None of these details reached Laura directly, but gossip had a way of spreading in quiet suburbs. Though she didn't yet know the specifics, Laura sensed that her husband was hiding something. She noticed how he grew tense whenever someone asked about work, or when the family calendar didn't quite match his explanations. Meanwhile, Marissa was beginning to grow impatient with Daniel's secrecy. For her, being kept hidden was a constant reminder of the parts of her life she was trying to escape. She wanted acknowledgement, proof that she mattered beyond locked doors and dimly lit apartments. She pressed Daniel for answers, asking when he would stop pretending she didn't exist outside of their stolen time together. Each time she raised the subject, Daniel's fear grew sharper. He pictured Laura finding out, his children learning the truth, his neighbors whispering not just rumors but facts. The thought of public exposure became unbearable. The strain of living between two worlds began to show in Daniel's behavior. At work he lost focus, making mistakes that colleagues noticed. At home he grew distant, often snapping at Laura over small things or retreating into silence. Even his children noticed his absence, not in body but in spirit. He was there at the dinner table, yet his mind was somewhere else. His mask of reliability, so carefully maintained, was starting to crack under the weight of lies. In his mind, the walls were closing in. Every text from Marissa felt like a threat, every glance from Laura like suspicion, every whisper from neighbors like confirmation that his secret was already out. His fear turned into paranoia, convincing him that discovery was inevitable. Yet instead of pulling away from Marissa, he felt trapped in the relationship, bound by emotions he couldn't admit and by lies he couldn't untangle. The more pressure built, the more desperate Daniel became. He convinced himself there was no safe way forward. If he stayed with Marissa, the truth would come out. If he left her, she might expose him out of anger or heartbreak. Each option looked like disaster, and Daniel's fragile control over his double life was unraveling fast. What began as secret companionship had now become a ticking clock, counting down to an explosion he could no longer prevent. The night was heavy with rain, the kind of storm that made the windows rattle and the streets empty. Daniel chose that night deliberately. With Laura and the children visiting her parents out of town, the house was quiet, the perfect setting for a conversation he told himself he needed to have. He invited Marissa over, convincing her that they could finally talk about the future, about where things were heading. But inside his mind, the purpose was far darker. He had reached a point where the pressure of secrecy felt unbearable, and he saw only one way to resolve the conflict that had consumed his life. When Marissa arrived, the warmth of her presence clashed with the cold dread growing inside Daniel. For years, she had been a secret he clung to, a person who represented freedom and passion away from his carefully constructed world. Now, in the very home where he celebrated birthdays and tucked his children into bed, she felt like the embodiment of everything he feared would destroy him. The suburban walls around them held years of family memories, but tonight they were witnesses to something far more sinister. The conversation started calmly, but it quickly turned sharp. Marissa wanted answers. She was tired of being hidden, tired of waiting for Daniel to acknowledge her openly. She pressed him for the truth. When would he stop lying to himself, to her, and to everyone else? Each word pushed Daniel closer to the edge. The storm outside seemed to echo his turmoil inside, lightning splitting the sky as his thoughts fractured. He imagined the scandal that would erupt if Marissa ever revealed their relationship. He pictured Laura's devastated face, his children's confusion, his neighbor's judgment, and the loss of everything he had built. He saw his career, his reputation, his entire identity crumbling in an instant. The weight of it all pressed down so hard that it felt suffocating. In a rush of panic, Daniel's fear transformed into action. He reached for the gun he kept in the house, a weapon meant for protection but now twisted into something else. Marissa's shock filled the room, but in Daniel's mind, he was already too far gone. The sound of the gunshot cut through the storm outside, leaving a silence that was almost unbearable. In those moments, the carefully maintained world of Daniel Thompson shattered. The living room, once a place of comfort and family gatherings, became a scene of violence and death. The rain continued to beat against the windows as Daniel stood over what he had done. The fear of exposure that had haunted him for so long was replaced by something even heavier. The knowledge that there was no turning back. The secret he had fought so hard to protect had ended in tragedy. His double life had collided with his family life in the most horrific way possible. What he thought was a solution had only created a nightmare that would destroy not just him but everyone connected to him. The storm outside raged on, mirroring the storm that now consumed his entire existence. When Laura pulled into the driveway with the children, she expected nothing more than a quiet return home after a weekend away. The house looked ordinary from the outside, its lights glowing softly against the gray skies. But the moment she stepped through the front door, everything she thought she knew about her life was ripped apart. The living room carried the smell of gunpowder and something far worse. Her eyes landed on the scene that would haunt her forever. Marissa's lifeless body sprawled on the floor, and Daniel standing nearby in a daze, the gun resting on the table as if it had been casually placed there. For a few long seconds, Laura could not process what she was seeing. The children's voices behind her grew quiet as confusion turned into fear. Her screams brought the neighbors running, and soon the house filled with flashing lights, radios crackling, and officers storming in. The peaceful suburban street, once known for potlucks and playdates, now became the backdrop of a crime scene. News vans arrived before dawn, their cameras catching every detail, while reporters whispered about the shocking double life of a man they thought they knew. The neighborhood where Daniel was admired as a dependable father now buzzed with disbelief and horror. The police moved quickly, securing the home and separating Daniel from his family. He was taken into custody without resistance, his face pale and blank. To the officers, he looked more like a man broken by fear than someone hardened by violence. Still, the evidence was undeniable. The weapon was his, the house was his, and the messages found on his devices tied him directly to Marissa. The man who had once appeared so ordinary was suddenly revealed as someone capable of extraordinary deception and brutality. Investigators worked around the clock, piecing together the hidden side of his life. They traced money transfers, uncovered online conversations, and spoke with Marissa's friends who confirmed the relationship. Each discovery painted a picture of a man consumed by secrets, trapped between two worlds he could not reconcile. Daniel's motive became clearer with every new piece of evidence. He had been terrified of exposure, so terrified that he had chosen violence over honesty. The media wasted no time turning the story into headlines. Local news stations replayed footage of the Thompson family home, while commentators speculated about how long Daniel's double life had gone on. National outlets picked up the story, highlighting not only the shocking crime, but also the hidden struggles faced by people forced into secrecy. Daniel's name became synonymous with betrayal, while Marissa's became a symbol of innocence, stolen too soon. For Laura, the betrayal cut deeper than the public could ever understand. Her husband had not only lied to her for years, but had also brought tragedy into their home. She felt anger, grief, and shame all at once. Her children asked questions she struggled to answer, their young minds unable to make sense of why their father had done something so unthinkable. The home that had once been a safe haven for her family was now a crime scene sealed with police tape, a place she could no longer bear to enter. Daniel's arrest marked the end of his freedom, but for everyone else, it was only the beginning of reckoning with the devastation he had left behind. What had started as whispers of suspicion ended in flashing lights, handcuffs, and the destruction of a family that once seemed untouchable. The trial of Daniel Thompson became one of the most talked-about cases in Ohio. Courtrooms filled with reporters, activists, and curious onlookers who wanted to see the man who had lived a perfect suburban life before it all unraveled. The prosecution laid out the case in stark detail, presenting the evidence of Daniel's double life with precision. Text messages between him and Marissa revealed years of secret meetings, while financial records showed unexplained spending that aligned with their encounters. Photos, hotel receipts, and testimonies painted a clear picture. Daniel had been desperate to keep his hidden relationship from being exposed, and when the fear of discovery became too much, he resorted to murder. The defense tried to frame Daniel as a man under unbearable pressure, torn between two worlds that had collided in a moment of panic. They spoke of his reputation, his years as a family man, and the stress that secrecy had caused him. But their arguments could not erase the brutality of what had taken place. The jury listened closely to every word, their eyes fixed on Daniel, who sat motionless in his chair, his expression unreadable. His wife, now separated from him, sat across the courtroom, avoiding his gaze, her face pale with grief and anger. Outside the courthouse, emotions ran high. Supporters of Marissa gathered with signs demanding justice, holding vigils in her honor. They spoke about her life, her dreams, and the way she had touched people who knew her. To them, she was not just a victim of violence, but a symbol of how secrecy and prejudice could lead to tragedy. For Daniel's family, the spectacle was unbearable. Laura shielded her children from cameras, doing everything she could to protect them from the endless questions and judgment. When the verdict was read, the room fell silent. Daniel was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The decision was swift, reflecting the weight of the evidence and the lack of remorse shown throughout the trial. In that moment, the carefully constructed image of the dependable suburban father was gone forever, replaced by the label of murderer. The aftermath left scars that could not be easily healed. Laura filed for divorce, cutting ties with the man she once believed she knew better than anyone. She moved her children away from the neighborhood, leaving behind the home that had become a place of nightmares. Neighbors who once admired Daniel struggled to reconcile the man they waved to on the street with the person revealed in court. The community, once bound by trust and familiarity, now carried the weight of suspicion and fear. Marissa's memory lived on through vigils, memorial services, and the voices of those who spoke out against the silence that had allowed Daniel's double life to thrive. Her friends and advocates worked to ensure she would be remembered not for how her life ended, but for the person she was. Yet the story of her death remained a haunting reminder of what secrets, fear, and desperation could do. Daniel's name faded into infamy, remembered not for the family he built or the life he once led, but for the darkness he unleashed inside his own home. What had seemed like the story of a perfect family ended as a chilling tale of deception, betrayal, and irreversible tragedy. The Thompson household, once a symbol of normalcy, became a cautionary tale that warned of the dangers lurking behind closed doors.